Let's make our way to the book of Joshua. We tried to take chapter 6 last week, but only made it down to verse 21. The good news is that we were able to cover all 4 of the keys to spiritual victory that we find in the 6th chapter. So this week we can put those behind us as spiritual strategy already attained. Principles for battle that we already have down pat that we're going to implement in our future. And then we can focus tonight on the specifics that remain in the chapter, which would be, beginning at verse 22, 6 verses that give us some much-needed closure to Israel's victory over Jericho. And let's just call a spade a spade. It was the Lord who brought down the walls of Jericho. It was the Lord that handed this victory to the nation of Israel. He did so with an atypical battle plan, and that was genius. Because the Lord used a battle plan that was just so out there so that when it actually did work as it did, the people would have no choice but to say, you know, there's really nothing that we did that had any positive effect or impact on this battle. It was just all the Lord. And so all the credit and all of the glory, all of the honor went to the Lord. We said that was key to spiritual victory number 4, the 4th and final key for spiritual victory. Credit where credit is due. Give God the credit for your spiritual wins. Give Him all of the glory for all of the good that happens in your life. And I know that is something that takes place after a spiritual victory has already been determined. And so maybe that doesn't seem to fit in your mind as one of the 4 keys to spiritual victory. But I would just remind you that it does belong, because just because a spiritual victory is already in the bag, that doesn't mean that we're off the clock. That doesn't mean that the whole process of victory is over with. It was Maya Angelou who once said that I can tell you a lot about a person by the way that they handle 3 things: a rainy day, lost luggage, and tangled Christmas lights. And there's a lot of truth to that. You can learn a lot about a person. You can see what they're really made of when they're up against things that are frustrating, difficult, or even annoying. But I would say that you can also learn a lot from a person based on how they handle success or victory. And I think sometimes that's even more telling. Now, as far as we are concerned as Christians, the way that we handle spiritual victory, that either cements that victory as a total victory, or through our negative responses after victory, it can detract from the victory itself. It can chip away at, it can cheapen and lessen the victory that we have won. This is known as a Pyrrhic victory. I don't know if you ever heard of that before. Pyrrhic, a Pyrrhic victory. That is a victory that you got, but it came at such a cost that the victory almost wasn't worth it. I don't know if you've ever had victories like that in your life. I have. Let me give you an example of that for you husbands. When you and wifey dear are in an argument and it turns out that you were actually right, that's a victory, probably a very rare one, but that's a victory until you tell your wife that you were right. Now it's a Pyrrhic victory. It came at great cost, and it almost wasn't worth the victory because now you're sleeping on the couch. Well, what Israel's going to attempt to do here is prevent this victory from becoming a Pyrrhic victory. They want this to be a complete victory, and really the way that you qualify this is you look at the fruit that is produced from the victory in your life. If it's producing good, godly characteristics, then you can pretty much be assured that your victory was a complete victory. But if it begins to produce negative things in you, for example, overinflated ego, self-confidence, arrogance, pride, independence from God, reliance on self, if it's producing those kinds of things, then it is a Pyrrhic victory. Spiritual victory should not produce those kinds of things in us. Spiritual victory should produce less trust in self and more trust in our God. That's a complete victory. And the evidence of that is going to be God getting the credit, God getting the glory from your life. So let's read along with Israel as they seek to avoid a Pyrrhic victory and try to cement this as a complete victory by obeying every command that God gave them for this battle and by giving God full credit and full glory for this victory over Jericho. Verse 22. But to the two men who had spied out the land, Joshua said, "Go into the prostitute's house and bring out from there the woman and all who belong to her, as you swore to her." Verse 23. So the young men who had been spies went in and brought out Rahab and her father and mother and brothers and all who belonged to her. So hard to tell how many people the Lord spared and saved here, but for sure it was more than just Rahab. It was her family as well. And reading on, it says, they brought all her relatives and put them outside the camp of Israel. So first of all, did everyone get our title and our title screen? Did everyone get that? Did you even see it? Are you? Okay, you're seeing it now, if nothing else. We stole this from the movie Saving Private Ryan. We even copied the movie screen for that. And I think it's some of Maggie's best title screen work. That is, unless we get fined for copyright infringement, in which case I knew nothing about it. This was all her. But that's what we're mainly going to be looking at tonight, is the rescuing of Rahab from the rubble of the walls of Jericho here. And everything good that happens in this chapter, it happens as a result of faith in God. That's what Hebrews chapter 11 focuses in on. We read last week, verse 30 of Hebrews chapter 11, which told us that by faith, the walls of Jericho fell down. But when we read the next verse, verse 31, it tells us that by faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient. So we see faith on both the part of Israel and Rahab and her family. It took faith for Israel to move forward on an otherwise outlandish battle plan and actually trust and believe that God was going to bring about victory through that plan. And as well, it took faith from Rahab and her family to trust in the promise of the two messengers, to trust in the promise of Yahweh and not freak out and head for the hills. But her faith was in the promise of those two spies and the God of those two spies, Yahweh. Her faith was in God and Israel, God's people, and that faith was blessed by the Lord as for 7 days the city of Jericho is under siege by the nation of Israel, and they actually have the bravery and the faith in God to stay put and not head for the hills. And so she and her family were rescued. According to verse 22, it tells us that they were rescued from her house. To me, that's a significant detail because of the story. And we say to ourselves, wait a minute, the walls of Jericho came down, right? Yep, that's true. Okay, well, didn't we read that Rahab's house was inside the wall of Jericho? Isn't that true? Yep, that's true as well. So what are we dealing with here? Are these two spies digging through the rubble to try to pull Rahab and her family out of the rubble? No, what we're learning just now from verse 22 is that God brought down the walls of Jericho except for one little section housing, the section that Rahab was living in. There's like a tower still standing there, 30 to 40 foot tower right there where Rahab was living. That is what we would call an all-out miracle of God. It is a perfect precision, divine demolition. The Lord destroyed all of it except for that little section. Her house is still standing. And I would have to think that Joshua and these two spies were quite relieved, because when they made this promise of salvation to Rahab, they did not know what the Lord's plan was going to be. They made that promise to Rahab most likely under the assumption that Israel was going to conquer Jericho through conventional warfare. And with conventional warfare, that's a piece of cake. There's that one house. It is marked with the scarlet rope hanging from the window. You just don't destroy anyone in that house. Everyone else you kill. Everyone else you destroy, but you leave that one house alone. Piece of cake. But how must the hearts of those two messengers dropped from their chests to their stomach when they heard Joshua say, guys, that's not the way that we're going to be doing this. That's not the way it's going to go down. I just spoke to the commander of the Lord's army, and he said he's taking the walls of Jericho down. He's leveling the place. Can you imagine what those two messengers were thinking? Oh, poor Rahab. We definitely overcommitted ourselves in that situation. We overpromised that poor thing. We had no idea the Lord was going to level the walls. She lives in the walls. We told her to stay put. We told her to do the most dangerous thing she could possibly be doing. And it brings us to a wonderful picture of modern day evangelism. These two spies, they promised something that they could not deliver on, and it had to be the Lord working behind the scenes, doing his part to fulfill that promise that those two spies made to Rahab. Evangelism for you and I is essentially the same thing. Think about what we're doing. We're going out into the world, we're speaking to unbelievers, and we're saying, the Lord will save you. He'll deliver you from that addiction. He'll deliver you from that problem. We're saying the Lord will change your life. He'll put his Spirit in you. And then the truth of it is we're kind of like these spies. We can't do anything about that. I think of this all the time because I'm constantly sharing the gospel and sharing the word with people, and I'm saying, hey, the Lord will save you. And then I'm thinking to myself, Lord, if you're not in this, then I am in way over my head. I promised salvation to this person. And I know full well I can't soothe that person's conscience over their sins. I know well I can't indwell them with the Holy Spirit. These are things that are beyond my control. As a messenger, Lord, I'm making promises on behalf of you and your word, but it's going to have to be you involved in the back end doing the things that are being promised by me, the messenger. I just had this happen actually today. It happens quite a bit. We make promises based on the word that we have no power to back up. And it takes God doing his part on the back end to bring about the kinds of things that we are promising to the world. The wonderful thing is the Lord always comes through. He never lets you down. If you're promising salvation to a lost world and they come to the Lord is going to do the work that you can't do. He's going to save them. If you're promising deliverance to the addict, the Lord is going to do the part you can't. He's going to deliver them. God is so good. But just for a moment, I want to go back to finding Rahab. First of all, we see that Joshua sent the two messengers that had offered salvation to Rahab in the first place, so they knew where Rahab's house was. They had been there before. But just in case they had forgot where she lived, it is now the only section of the wall remaining, so there's no chance that they could possibly miss that. It's just her house with the scarlet cord hanging from it, which brings us back to that scarlet cord, that scarlet rope. And the way I see this is, as far as anything physical and earthly is concerned, this scarlet rope was really unnecessary. It really wasn't used for identification, was it? Now, it is true that for 13 days, for 13 passes, over 7 days, the whole nation of Israel, the army, would know where Rahab's house was. They would know who they were saving because every pass around, they would see that scarlet cord hanging from the window, and that meant God is going to spare that woman and her house. So at this point, the whole nation would know where her house was. But it turns out they wouldn't really need that scarlet rope hanging there as an identifier of where she lived, because God wiped out everything but that section. So we come back to this, and I start to think about this a little deeper, and I'm like, Lord, if you knew they wouldn't need the scarlet rope to identify the house where the woman was to be saved, then why did this happen in the first place? And the truth of it is that it had nothing to do with the rescue of Rahab except for the symbolism that is behind it. There's deep symbolism behind this. And we talked about it when we studied Joshua chapter 2. We talked about it even when we were studying the book of Exodus. The scarlet rope is a wonderful picture of salvation. It is a wonderful picture of the rescue of the Lord. That scarlet rope that was hanging from Rahab's window is a type of Christ and his shed blood for us. Here's the picture, is that in matters of salvation, Christ is our lifeline. He is our rescue rope from destruction. So it's just a beautiful picture. It is this scarlet rope that we see weaving all of the way through the scriptures. It's just a type, but it points to Christ and what he would do to rescue us. Just think of the picture, the scarlet rope being let down from the scarlet rope from destruction to rescue. That is Christ and his sacrifice for us. It's a beautiful picture. I could talk about it all night, but I won't. Verse 24. And they burned the city with fire and everything in it. Only the silver and gold and the vessels of bronze and of iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. And again, we covered this last week. Verse 18, verse 19, verse 21. And now we see it in verse 24, that anything perishable was to be burned and anything imperishable was to be tucked away in the treasury and then later on melted down and repurposed for the nation of Israel. Israel was going to get the majority of all of the goods in the land of Canaan, but for this first battle, this is what we talked about last week, for this first battle, Joshua says everything belongs to the Lord. That's how we're going to show God that he gets all the credit, that he gets all the honor, all the glory for this battle. We're going to give him all the stuff. And it brings to mind two different principles from the Old Testament law. And I shared these with you last week, but lest you forgot, I'm going to share them again. It is, first of all, the principle of first fruits or tithing. And that is the principle that God gets the first of all of your dough. That means your grain, and that means your money, your dough. God gets the first of all your dough. And then according to Old Testament law, what do you do with something that is offered up to the Lord? How do you signify that? How do you show that? This is known as the burnt offering or the consecration offering. The way you show that is by burning it to a crisp. And that was the case with the fellowship offerings as well. If you brought grain or if you brought drink offering and you were fellowshipping with the Lord, to show that, you would eat your portion and drink your portion, and for the Lord's portion, it would be burnt up. That was the way of symbolizing God took his share. So we have the principle of first fruits or tithing here. We also have the principle of the burnt offering in dedicating and consecrating all of the goods, all of the booty. Or we should have brought out the Pirate Bible for this. All of the booty that comes from this victory, all of it goes to the Lord. Verse 25. But Rahab the prostitute and her father's household and all who belonged to her, Joshua saved alive. And she has lived in Israel to this day. Wow, she must be very old. My goodness. How old would that make? No, that's not what it's saying, of course. It means at the time of this writing, she was still alive and living in the nation of Israel. Reading on, because she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. That was her putting her faith into action. Now, the inclusion of Rahab in this story is so deep and so rich to me because this goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 15, when God made a promise to give Abraham and his descendants the land of Canaan. And I want to read to you what the Lord declared in verses 15 and 16. He said this to Abraham, "As for you, Abraham, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. And they, Israel, shall come back here to Canaan in the fourth generation," so sometime after 400 years, "for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete." So that is God telling Abraham, I'm giving you this land, but I can't give it to you right now. And the reason I can't give it to you right now is because things aren't yet as bad as they could be in Canaan. The people there are wicked, but it's not yet to the point where it would move my hand in judgment and wrath. So in other words, God is saying, there's still a chance. There's still a chance for Canaan to turn and come to the Lord. So what God did was he gave them an inordinate amount of time. He gave them, to be exact, 430 years to right the ship. Man, we definitely should have used the Pirate Bible tonight. He gave 430 years for Canaan to right the ship. And what did God do in the meantime? I want to make sure you understand this. God didn't sit back for 430 years and just watch them march to their doom. Oh well, going in the wrong direction. God did not do that. God was making attempts at course correction. He was calling the people in the land of Canaan to repentance. He was calling them to obedience. Arlyn, how do you know that? Can you prove that? I sure can. In fact, I already have. We read it in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 31. Listen to it again. By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient. It's talking about the Canaanites there, the Amorites, all of the other ites. She didn't perish with those who were disobedient. Now, if God is calling Canaan, the citizens of Canaan, disobedient, what does that mean? It means that for 430 years, he was calling them to obedience. You cannot be disobedient if you weren't first given instructions or commands. You can only be disobedient if you knew better. If you'd been given commands or directions and you refused to obey those commands or directions. So for 430 years, you better believe that God was trying to call the Canaanites away from their lifestyle to a better lifestyle that would push back the judgment and the wrath of God and cause God to say, whether they were servants of his or not, had their moral and ethic behavior improved, to say, they may not be mine, but they're not so wicked that I need to destroy their influence from the face of the earth. But for all of God's efforts and for all of the time that he gave them to get this thing right, they chose not to obey God except for this one family. Just one family among the millions of Canaanites. There's this one family, Rahab and her family, who chose obedience to the God of Israel. So I just want you to see this, folks. Don't feel bad for the Canaanites. God actually exacted justice in this situation. He had given them time. He had called. They had refused. 430 years wasn't enough time for them to get this right. They chose wickedness, and it's the kind of wickedness that I don't even want to talk about here tonight. I mean, these people were horrible, horrible people. Maybe even horrible, horrible, horrible people. 3 horribles worth. They were horrible people. They did things that certainly would have negatively impacted the cultures around them, the world around them. They were so wicked that the Lord had only one option for them: to stop it at all costs, whether that be that they turn and change their behavior, or whether that be that the Lord would wipe them out. And so they chose to push the hand of God in this situation. I don't have to tell you, you all know this, that our current world is following this exact same course. You should see the proof of that everywhere that you look. This world is quickly becoming so desperately wicked. And here we are among the spirit of the Antichrist in the world around us as messengers for the Lord, calling people back to the Ten Commandments, calling people to the Lord, calling them to repent and be saved. And what is the world going to choose for themselves? Well, by and large, you know how this goes. Even among the church, we know a great apostasy is coming, a turning away from the Lord by church people, by professing Christians. And then outside of the church, it's even worse. It's going to get tougher and tougher to win them to Christ. The world is going to hell in a handbasket, and there seems to be no stopping it. And it is not that they don't know. It wasn't that Canaan didn't know. They knowed, and they just chose to do nothing about it. Sometimes when you pick the wrong word, you just got to go with it. Hope no one notices. And the world around us knows too. They know all about it. They know what is truly happening, and they just choose not to be a part of salvation. Rahab chose God and his people, so the Lord saved Rahab, and it was biblical salvation. Don't you know that? The Lord didn't rescue Rahab from destruction just to leave her the same person in a different location. This wasn't like, same job, different location. I was a prostitute in Jericho, now I'm a prostitute in Israel. God didn't save her to leave her the same. God saved her, and God put Rahab through rehab. I got to give credit to Arlyn Lane for that one. He told me to pop that joke on you, so if you didn't like it, that one's his fault. God put Rahab through his rehab program. He changed that woman's life. He built her character. He produced in her the kind of character that is fitting of his people. And she's not even from the nation of Israel. She's not a Jew. But the Lord picked her. He chose her. He rehabbed her. He sanctified her and made her a perfect reflection of the work of salvation that the Lord had done in her life. And it is the exact same for you and I. God never saves us to leave us the same. He saves us to mold us into the image of his Son, according to Romans chapter 8, verse 29. That means if you get saved, it's not that you have to change. It's just that you will change. If you're really saved, you're going to change. It's not going to be, do I have to? It's going to be, I get to. I get to change. I get to see the Lord shape my character in a whole new different direction. I get to see the Lord take away some of the flaws that I had in the past and make me into something that's better and brighter for him. God took a woman with a shady past and he gave her a bright future. And he wants to do the same for each and every one of us. Rahab, this is something we already spoke about when we were studying chapter 2 of this book. Rahab would end up marrying a Jewish man named Salmon, and that was unthinkable for a Jewish man to marry a former prostitute. Unthinkable. Salmon was really swimming upstream on that one, but he married her, and that was Alan too, if you didn't like it. Any of these jokes you don't like, it was Alan. But this guy, this Jew, he married a former prostitute, and they end up having a child named Boaz, and Boaz ends up marrying a Moabitess, a non-Jew named Ruth. And Boaz and Ruth would end up bringing about the birth of King David, and then from King David's lineage would come King Jesus. And we get to see this wonderful thing that God did in this woman's life. Rahab, who was a hooker in Jericho, she's now the great-great-grandmother of King David. She's the great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother of King Jesus. Just an amazing story. And we read her insert there in Matthew chapter 1 as Matthew is listing the genealogy of Jesus the Christ. and he comes to Salmon, who gave birth to Boaz, and he could have just left it at that. But Matthew, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, is careful in that moment to point this out, that it was Salmon, the father of Boaz, by Rahab. And I just love that. God not only allowed Rahab to be a part of the family, the lineage of his son, but he was so proud of that he wanted the whole world to know that Jesus, the Messiah, was a descendant from a former prostitute that the Lord had saved and changed and worked in and produced something beautiful in her life. It is just one of the most amazing stories ever. It beats all of the Hallmark movies that you ladies are getting ready to sit down and watch for Christmas time. Where the prince from overseas marries the no-name from the United States. It's all the same movie, right? Just different actors, but all the same plot. This is even better. No fiction writer can top what God did in the life of Rahab. The best part is that it's true. It really happened. Beautiful story. Well, verse 26, Joshua laid an oath on them at that time, saying, "Cursed before the Lord be the man who rises up and rebuilds this city, Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn shall he lay its foundation, and at the cost of his youngest shall he set up its gates." Now you hear that warning, and you avoid Jericho. You just delete that from your map, your GPS. You're never going to rebuild that city. And yet, in spite of that stern warning, that curse that Joshua gives, there was actually a man by the name of Hiel, Hiel, in 1 Kings chapter 16, that decided to do just that. He decided that he was going to rebuild the city of Jericho. He was going to rebuild these walls. And I want to read this verse to you. It's 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 34. It says, "In his days, Hiel," no relation to Hitler if you're wondering, "in his days, Hiel of Bethel," no connection to the church, Bethel Church, "he built Jericho. He laid its foundation at the cost of Abiram, his firstborn, and set up its gates at the cost of his youngest son, Segub, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke by Joshua, the son of Nun." And what that should mean to you and I is that when God knocks walls down in our lives, he intends for them to stay down. He does. He doesn't want you rebuilding the walls. Makes me think of the religious leaders in the New Testament, the priests, the rabbis, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. After the resurrection of Jesus, after the death of Jesus, the veil of the temple was torn in half. And historically, we know that the first thing they did was they got back in there and they sewed that thing back up. God tore that in half. He was declaring open house, open access into the presence of God. God tore that wall down between man and him. And the first thing man did was say, we got to build that wall right back up. We got to get that veil right back up. And if you're not careful, the same thing will happen in your life. You'll get a victory. God will tear a wall down, and bit by bit and piece by piece, you'll just start rebuilding that wall. And you got to be careful with your friends too, because they'll help you rebuild it. They're quick to help you. Arlyn, you forgave that person? Are you serious? What they did is pretty awful. I wouldn't have let them off the hook if I were you. Really? Wow, maybe I shouldn't have been so quick to forgive. Thank you for the brick. Thank you for the mortar. I'll start building the wall. Arlyn, the Lord tore down that wall of addiction in your life. So, you've kicked it. You've conquered it. What's it going to hurt if you do it just occasionally, every once in a while? You've mastered it, no problem. You're not going to fall back under the bondage of it. Really? Maybe you're right. Maybe I shouldn't be so strict. Thank you for the brick. Thank you for the mortar. I'll rebuild my walls. No, don't rebuild the walls that the Lord has torn down. It needs to stay down forever. So anytime you're tempted to start to build back up something that God tore down in your life, something that needs to stay down in your life, would you remember this study? Would you remember this chapter? Would you come back here? Would you listen to this again? And then determine in your heart, God, you gave me victory in this. You tore down that wall, and I'm not going to build it back up again. Verse 27. So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame was in all the land. Fame. Feels uncomfortable reading that about a servant of the Lord. It's a topic that's a little bit difficult to talk about. I was thinking this through in my study time, really racking my brain. How do I address this issue of fame and the child of God? First of all, I would say this, that fame that comes with spiritual accomplishment is the only kind of fame that isn't empty. Every other kind of fame that you get from OnlyFans, from a music career, from an acting career, any kind of other fame that you get, it is completely empty and lonely. And if you don't believe me, then track down those that have made it, those that have accomplished great fame in their life, and they're going to tell you the same thing. Fame isn't where it's at. Whatever you think fame is going to do for you, if it's not fame associated with spiritual accomplishment, it is more empty than you would ever imagine. It's lonely and it's empty at the top of that kind of fame. But fame that comes from spiritual accomplishment is not quite so empty, although it is a little bit dangerous for the spiritual well-being of those who have it. Now, first, I would like to just start with a clear statement that fame that comes from God is not something that we are to desire or strive for in life. We shouldn't ever be doing anything that we do for God so that we can get fame out of it. That's just a bad motivation of the heart to begin with. But with that said, every once in a while, God will bring Christian fame, if I can call it that, Christian fame to his servants. And when it is fame that truly comes from God, then it is God's way of honoring his servant, and that's a good thing. We can list out a bunch of famous Christians, can't we? First of all, let's start in the Bible. How about Moses? How about Joshua, verse 27 of Joshua chapter 6? Famous Christians, guys with godly fame in their lives. The prophets, Elijah, Samuel, King David, John the Baptist, the Apostle Peter, the Apostle Paul, the Apostle John. So we could list out a lot of famous Christians or famous servants of God. And when God does bring fame to a servant, that servant has to be extremely careful how they handle that fame. Christendom has been replete with examples of men and women who did not handle that fame in the right way. We've watched them fall publicly, brutally. The danger is in letting that fame go to your heart and to your head. That's where the danger is. Every time the Lord honors you in some way, what you have to do as you achieve Christian fame is ignore that fame personally. Don't let it get to your heart. Don't let it get to your head. And instead use that fame to keep pointing your fans back to the Lord. So, Tammy, when Christianity Today calls and says, we want you on the cover of our magazine next month, now you know how to handle it. And the rest of us, we love you, so we will help to keep you grounded by offering up critiques and humbling you. That's what we do as a church family. Now, honestly, that was a joke, but that's actually a good point, and that is that God always has a way to keep his true servants humbled. And even when you come into fame, you're always going to have more critics than you do fans, or at least it's going to feel like that. Because if you're being praised on one side and criticized on another, I'm pretty sure all of our hearts are wired to be more impacted by the criticism than the praise. So the Lord has a way to keep us humble, but we have to do our part. We have to keep it in the same place, in the right place. We have to keep God at the center of it, use it to point to the Lord, and just ignore that it's even there. If you walk downtown and everybody knows who you are because you're a Christian star, you have to ignore that. You have to forget that it exists and use it, leverage it to point to the Lord. I say this because I expect just about all of you to end up as Christian stars in this world. That's how special I think you are. All right, chapter 7. Totally kidding. Totally kidding. We were long last week, so we're going to stand and close with that and give you an early night